JD Vance, and we can say that by historical standards, he is the most unpopular VP pick to have emerged in the history of American polling.
Wow. There've been a number of polls that we're all paying attention to, particularly given the intervention of Kamala Harris, whom the Trump campaign said would be even easier to beat than President Biden. But the polls tell a mixed picture, some of it quite positive for Harris.
Yes, that's right. And really, you and I have talked many times about how in British politics, you shouldn't focus on one poll and you should look at the long-term trends. But in America, that's really, really important at the moment. If you are a huge supporter of Kamala Harris, you can point to particular polls that paint a very good picture for her. And similarly, if you're a big supporter of Donald Trump, you can point at her work at polls that show that he is doing extremely well. What is the reality? The reality is we do not know, because these are completely unprecedented times, not just with the emergence of Kamala Harris replacing Joe Biden, not just because Kamala Harris has not picked her own VP yet, not just because Donald Trump was the victim of an assassination attempt, but the combination of all of these and many other things make it very, very difficult. And it's also worth remembering that historically speaking, in presidential style elections, as opposed to parliamentary elections such as our own, people make their mind up much later. There's a lot of academic work that shows that's the case. And also, particularly with the presidential election in the US, it's been shown that polls 100 days out, and we're 99 days out at the moment, bear very little resemblance historically to the final result. And ultimately, this will come down to probably 8 to 10 states, which will be very close, and the result there rather than the national picture.
Yeah, and let's looking at the most recent, I think this is the most recent one anyway, the Wall Street Journal poll, which has been quoted by lots of papers here in this country. And the headline of that was that Kamala Harris has virtually erased Donald Trump's 6-point lead in the US for US president. And when you look not just at that one, but at some of the other polling, among, say, Black and Latino and young voters, all showing greater support for Kamala Harris than they did Joe Biden, although her support among non-white voters is still lower than that voted for Mr. Biden 4 years ago. You are able to build up more of a picture than just taking a wild stab in the dark.
A picture of where we are at the moment.
Yes.
But where we are at the moment is in the immediate aftermath of Kamala Harris's appointment, and there's still a long time to go, and that's important. But it's worth keeping in mind that a lot of the polls that you quoted then refer to the national picture, the popular vote, as Americans call it. And here's where things get really interesting, because you talked about the fact that Kamala Harris has closed the gap on Donald Trump in the popular vote. He's still ahead on the popular vote. But he didn't win the popular vote in 2016 when he won the presidential election. He also didn't win the popular vote last time around when he lost to Joe Biden. In fact, Republicans only won the popular vote once since 1988, and that was in 2004, amidst extraordinarily unusual circumstances with George W. Bush and the Iraq War. And so do we really think that, looking at it historically, this time around, after everything that has happened, this time is when Donald Trump's going to win the popular vote? That strikes me as unlikely. And so I think it demonstrates very clearly how where we are at the moment bears very little resemblance, we think, to where we could be come November. You can suggest it might go this way, you can suggest it might go that way, and you might be correct. But it is simply speculation at this present time.
Mm-hmm. And in those 8 or so swing states that you referred to a moment ago, Joe, do they do the same multi-level regression and post-stratification, the MRP polls, that became such a talking point in our just concluded election?
Not always. In fact, very rarely does it happen, certainly at this stage of the campaign. Instead, it doesn't even, in a lot of cases, tend to be done via online surveys, which is the way that we and many other countries do it. Instead, in a lot of cases, those really important state-level polls are done by telephone. And telephone polls in this country, in the US, and across the developed world have extraordinarily large issues with them. Lots of people in the United States don't have landlines, which means you have to call people on mobiles. Lots of people don't like answering their mobiles to phone numbers they don't recognize. And even if they do, they may not have time to answer questions. So there are lots of question marks over all of the polls, but particularly those state level polls in America. And what that means is the margin of error around those results tends to be much larger. And in a contest that, as we have seen in the past, could be won in an individual state by tens of thousands of votes, extrapolating that up to what it could mean in the polls makes it very difficult to say. And that's why, as I say, for all of the listeners at home, it could go one way, it could go the other. And at the moment, it's not possible to tell from the polling.
Yeah, I'm just looking at 538, which is a very, very popular website, quite respected. Looking at 4 boxes: do Americans approve or disapprove of Kamala Harris? Looking at the average polls there, and then whether Americans have a favorable opinion of Donald Trump, and they're slicing it up in that way. Which polls or which organizations do you, as a professional pollster, pay most attention to? Which ones do you respect most?
Oh, well, that's a really interesting question because actually we talked about the statewide polling, and really that's the only important bit, because finding out that Kamala Harris is going to win in California, for instance, is not going to provide much insight in terms of the overall result.
Yeah.
And so instead, I look at those. I look at the companies that are conducting state level polls, and the vast majority of state level polls up until this point have only been produced by 3 different companies. And I have to say, I have thoughts about
Mhm.
all 3 of them,
Yes.
and so it will take some time before the myriad of different polling organizations in the United States, with their different methods and different analytics, start turning their attention to statewide polls, and that's when I think things will get more interesting. Historically, it's after Labor Day that the
Yes.
polls start having an impact. As I say, we haven't even had the Democratic convention. We don't know who's going to be Kamala Harris's VP yet. So after that, we may start to see some sort of patterns emerge. But at the moment, it really is anyone's game.
And when it comes to polls and attitudes, how much of an issue do you think the comments of JD Vance and his perspective on families, on women, on cat ladies, how much of an issue might that be in people's minds as we go through this campaign? Because we're still, as you say, 99 days out, but it's causing an awful lot of excitement, and it's mobilizing a lot of not just African American women, white American women, and they're throwing money at Kamala Harris, and they're saying this is going to be decisive. You know, women's rights, body autonomy, abortion is on the ballot.
Yes, that's right. And I think, rather than focusing on JD Vance
Yeah.
specifically, though we'll come back to that in a second, I think the huge importance of reproductive autonomy in the United States, I think that will be a driving issue for many people, but particularly women, and particularly young women.
Yeah.
And yes, they tend to vote Democrat in the past, but what this may do is not change their vote from Republican to Democrat in many cases, because in a lot of cases they would have been Democrat already, but it will get them to turn out to vote. That
Yeah.
massively important second dimension, not just which party you're going to vote for and which candidate you're going to vote for, but whether you're going to turn out and vote or not. And JD Vance is interesting because we've talked about the fact that polls will change, and there will be some fluctuation. But what we do have is a hard data point now for JD Vance, and we can say that by historical standards, he is the most unpopular VP pick to have emerged in the history of American polling.
Wow.
And that demonstrates that perhaps things may be more difficult for Donald Trump with regards to that moving on. He really hasn't proved to be a popular figure so far. Of course, it may be that, again, he's there not to convert people, and it doesn't matter that lots of people don't like him if he manages to energize a certain proportion of Donald Trump's base that previously perhaps would not have turned out to vote. But certainly you would prefer your VP candidate to be popular than unpopular.
Yeah.
And with JD Vance, it appears he is the latter.
A brilliant point there. Thank you very much indeed to Joe Twyman